good to be here, and thanks for those who are viewing or listening in. Luke asked me to talk about forest stand improvement and implications and considerations for wildlife, and that's what we're going to do. And I think we'll have plenty of time to try and answer questions if you have any when I'm finished. All right, well, the first thing I like to cover when I talk about forest stand improvement, number one is the inherent difference between forest stand improvement and what you might call timber stand improvement, where usually the objective is solely on the timber value, both species, composition, as well as stand volume and marketability, et cetera. But in forest stand improvement, your objectives can be anything. It might be timber, might be wildlife, might be aesthetics, all kinds of different reasons that you might be managing your woods for wildlife. Of course, you should consider having a forest management plan and wildlife management plan conducted for your property and in the stands that you are working in. And I always like to tell people you should involve not just a forester, but a biologist as well. You know, foresters can do a very good job with forest management and not do wildlife. A biologist might have all the knowledge related to the biology or ecology of a given species or guild of species, lots of different wildlife species that may be occurring in the stand, but really don't know that much about silviculture and how that might impact wildlife. So I always get people to think about involving both foresters and wildlife biologists in their plans. There are essentially, as I see it, and when I boil things down to be as simple as possible, you essentially have three options with regard to managing your stands for wildlife. One is to regenerate the stand, and that means to harvest the trees and start the stand anew. And of course, there are different systems that can be used, even-aged, two-aged, and uneven-aged systems, and each of those have regeneration methods that are involved with those systems. If you're not going to regenerate the stand, and you may not wish to, the trees may not be ready to harvest, you might not have advanced regeneration that you were hoping to, et cetera. So then another option is not to regenerate the stand, but simply to improve the stand. And in general, we incorporate thinnings and various improvement cuts. Of course, we can use prescribed fire. There's various herbicide applications that can be conducted. So various ways that we can improve the stand. And of course, we're going to talk about that more in depth here in a minute. And then lastly, you can clear the stand. And that's not to clear cut the stand. Clear cut is a regeneration method that is used within even-aged management system. But I'm talking about clearing the trees. It's not going to be a forest anymore. So you might have an area of woods that you would rather be in early successional vegetation, various openings that might fit in your objectives. And so you would simply be clearing the area of the tree. So, I mean, I can't think of an easier way to break that down, that you can start the stand anew, you can improve it, or you can clear it. And then of course, you can also do nothing. Perhaps the composition and structure of the stand might fit your objectives perfectly well as it is. So as we boil that down, I think that's about as simple as I can get it. And what we're going to concentrate on is improving the stand. Now, think about your objectives related to each of these options. If you're going to regenerate the stand, then by definition, that means you have forestry objectives. If you're going to improve the stand, then your objectives may be forestry related, it might be wildlife, or it might be a combination of the two. And that's oftentimes the case. And then of course, if you're going to clear the stand, then it's got to be driven by wildlife or other than timber quality, because you're getting rid of the trees in the area. So thinking about your options and the objectives, and what we're going to concentrate on here over the next 45 minutes or so is to improve the stand. So in forest stand improvement, As I mentioned, you can have various objectives, and wildlife and aesthetics are oftentimes the primary ones for folks who are doing this. I mentioned that we can use thinnings to decrease the density of trees and allow increased sunlight. We might release favored species by killing competitors adjacent to those species. I'll show some pictures of that in a few minutes. And then improvement cuttings obviously can improve the composition of the stand throughout. And especially in upland situations, but also in some bottomland situations, we can use prescribed fire to help influence the composition and structure of the understory, which then influences the food and cover availability for different wildlife species in a big way. And as you can see in the picture, if I can move this bar, you can see in the picture, Luke, can you see my pointer?
Yes, we can.
Okay, you see where these trees, for example, have been girdled to kill them, and we've allowed additional sunlight to come into the stand. And this is the type of understory composition and structure that we're getting in this scenario, but I'll show plenty more pictures here in a minute. So think about your objectives. To influence the composition, what does that mean? That means influence which species of trees that you have in the stand. And as related to wildlife, oftentimes we're trying to favor mast producers, both hard mast and soft mast. And so we release the trees that we like, and we can either fail or kill those that we don't like, species that are not helping with our objectives. And we do that to a certain level to allow a certain amount of sunlight into the stand. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit. The structure, and you'll hear me use that word frequently, that is referring to the density and the height of the vegetation. And so obviously the structure is strongly related to the quality of cover that is available for different wildlife species that are using the stand. And it's also very influential on the visibility. And that can be very important for species that are very popular among a lot of landowners, especially deer and wild turkey, for example. And I'll talk more about increasing the visibility within stands and why you would be interested or concerned with that. So in terms of getting rid of the trees you don't want and leaving the trees you do want, there are a number of ways to go about that. But the two that are most popular and used most commonly is to, of course, either cut or fell the tree, and that's applicable in many situations, but also to simply kill the tree by either girdling it and then spraying an herbicide mixture into the girdle, or to use what we call hack and squirt, where you may use a hatchet or a machete to, in general, inflict a wound by a cut at about a 45-degree angle every 2 or 3 inches around the tree. And here you can see another cut, and we simply introduce the herbicide into these cuts, and then that kills the tree. Now, personally, I like to use a small chainsaw, and I girdle the trees, and then we spray the solution into the girdle. That way I know the tree is dead, because if you only girdle the trees and do not introduce the herbicide mixture, many of those trees will not die. And so if you're not using herbicides, your best bet then would be to double girdle the tree and actually remove the bark in between the girdle. I have double girdled many trees and without using herbicide, and still the trees, and it varies by species, do not die. And so to be most effective, one of these squirt bottles costs about $8 full of the herbicide mixture. And I listed down here on the bottom the herbicide mixture that we use: 50% Garlon 3A, 10% Arsenal AC, and 40% water. And always put the water in the middle. Don't add the Garlon or the triclopyr on top of the Arsenal, which contains imazapyr, because it will gel in the bottle if you do that. So put the water in before you put the last herbicide into the squirt bottle. In general, with regard to stimulating good understory response, you will want to have a minimum of 20% sunlight entering the stand. Increasing that to 30% generally is good. If you're wanting more dense cover, less visibility, then I would allow 50% or more sunlight into the stand. And again, I'll show you some pictures of this as we go on. But with regard to stimulating the understory to provide increased forage for various species such as deer, increased soft mast, you'll want to have at least 20% sunlight coming into the stand. To relate that to closed canopy conditions, in a closed canopy stand, normally
Craig,
2 to 5
Craig, we're having a little bit of internet connectivity issues.
Sunlight entering the stand. And if you only mature stuff,
Craig, can you hear us still? Looks like your video is back, but it looks like maybe your presentation stopped sharing.
okay, you can't see the presentation?
It just dropped off. I think it was maybe a momentary disconnection. And so, yeah, I think we need you to reshare your screen.
Okay.
We're getting a little bit of pauses in your audio. So far, it hasn't been bad. We've been able to make out everything so far, but just to give you a little bit heads up.
Wow, sorry about this.
That's right. And just for the audience, while Dr. Harper brings that up, he's joining us from the road. He's I'm always impressed how much field work he's doing from Georgia to Tennessee to all over the place. So I'm sure he's probably giving a talk at some conference or somewhere else right now. But all right.
Can you see now?
You're back.
Okay, good. Sorry about that. I'm not sure what happened, but anyway. Okay, I mentioned influence in the composition. Did you get that, or was it frozen?
That's about where I think we even got to the part, I think maybe to the next slide where you were talking about Arsenal and Garlon.
Yes.
Yeah, and we were wrapping this there. I think you were right about here.
Okay, yeah. To allow at least 20% sunlight into the stand is really what we're shooting for, to get the understory response that most people are expecting or need in order to meet their objectives when doing this. And so here's just a picture of a girdle, and you can see how it's just a shallow cut. All we're doing is cutting into the inner bark layer where the cambium exists and where nutrients flow from the crown of the tree to the roots. And that's where we spray the herbicide. Here you can see a picture of that from a cut stump. And this is where we would apply the herbicide if you have cut the tree and you don't want it to sprout. And so if you can see my pointer, applying the herbicide along the cambium layer is all you need to kill the stump. If you apply the herbicide down into here, that's not doing anything. So just go around the edge of the stump. And this is the result that we get. Typically, it takes these trees 3 to 4 months before they begin to wilt and start shedding the leaves. And some species take longer than a time of year, but a restriction is with some species such as red or sugar maple in late winter, early spring, when the sap is really flowing, you literally can have water running out of the girdle. And so obviously that would flush your herbicide mixture and your results would be lessened because of that. And so, but other than that, you can do this at any time of year. If you do this in spring, the trees will slowly die over summer. And by the time the other trees go into senescence, those trees that you treated will be dead. If you treat in summer, they will decline through the summer. And then the following spring, they should not leaf out. Same thing if you do this in the fall. If you do it in the winter, some of the trees will leaf out that spring, but they will quickly be wilting and shedding their leaves as the process continues and they slowly die. And so, of course, we are left with standing dead trees. And, you know, this brings an interesting thought to the term healthy hardwoods or healthy hardwood forest. But I would say that there is no single feature within a stand that can enhance, increase wildlife diversity any more than dead wood, both standing and down dead wood. There are so many species that are closely tied to that dead wood, many species that require that for food and cover requirements. And so having standing dead wood in the stand, and then over time, down wood can be very important if wildlife species diversity is important to you. And so after killing these trees, you notice the crowns of these then are able to expand. And over time, they fill in, and it happens fairly quickly. In fact, what we have recorded is a 25% increase in crown size when you practice total release. And what that means is if there are trees on all sides of the tree that you're going to release, if all of those are removed all the way around that tree that you're wanting to release, it responds very quickly, approximately 25% increase in size, in crown size in only 1 year. And that's pretty significant. And in doing a lot of work with acorn production, and this was with white oak trees, but the same effect is seen with other tree species as well. There's lots of folks who have done work looking at acorn production, following different forest stand practices. What we find is after implementing forest stand improvement, where you're releasing those favored trees, about 40% of the trees are producing 70% of the acorns. Now, before you release those trees and you're in a closed canopy stand, approximately 30% of the trees produce 70% of the acorns. After you release those crowns, a few of them will bump up in production class. And so what we did here is we categorized the trees as either poor producers, moderate producers, good producers, or excellent producers. So here you can see about 40% of the individual trees produce about 70% of the acorns. And that is after those trees have been released for about 5 years. And like I said, prior to that, that difference is even greater, whereas about 30% of the trees are producing the lion's share, or nearly 3/4 of the acorns. So that's significant. What that means is it can be very important to identify those individual trees that are the strong acorn producers. And so if you're wanting to increase mast production in a mixed stand, then of course you would kill or cut those trees that do not produce mast. But also theoretically, if you are in a solid oak stand, you could reduce the number of white oaks, let's say, is what I'm showing you data from here. You could reduce the number of white oaks by 50% and still increase acorn production. And so all the while you're getting increased sunlight coming in, you're getting increased food and cover production in the understory. And so this is one situation in which you literally can have your cake and eat it too, with regard to a productive understory, as well as an increased productivity in the overstory. Of course, you see a lot of advertisements that talk about fertilization to help you produce increased acorns and even sweeter acorns. Of course, you need to take this with a grain of salt, so to speak. We looked at this over a 10-year period, looking at the effect of fertilization and how that may influence acorn production. And so we fertilized white oaks with nitrogen, phosphate, and potash to high levels, collected acorns, and we looked at what percentage of the acorns might be depredated by rodents. Of course, weighed the acorns and conducted a nutritional analysis on those that had been fertilized, the trees that had been fertilized versus those that had not. And long story short, the fertilization had no effect whatsoever on acorn production. Now, of those trees that were released, you can see we recorded a 65% increase in acorn production after the trees were released. And take note, that is just on a square meter basis underneath the trees, meaning that the twig density in the crown increased after the tree had been released. And so that's not even accounting for the increase in crown size, such as the diameter of this crown and the volume of this crown. So you can see significant increases in acorn production simply by releasing these trees and allowing more sunlight all the way around. With crown release and fertilization, we recorded a 47% increase in acorn production, but with fertilization alone, we recorded no increase whatsoever. So just think about ways in the trees in your stand that you might want to release, and for to what degree. There may be other trees that are adjacent that you also want to keep. That's fine. I'll show you some more pictures of this in just a second, but full crown release is where you get the most response. Of course, some of the trees that you would be taking out may have marketable value, and that's fine. The thing that I remind landowners of is that, of course, most of the trees that they are retaining are going to be some of the higher value trees. And so when loggers take out the trees that you don't want, there's always a risk of scarring up the bole of those trees that you retain, and then that can lead to decreased value of those. So some of that will happen. Just keep that in mind, and also realize that loggers, that they can't come in and just take out the junk, so to speak. They're going to have something that will pay its way out of the woods. And for smaller tracts, what this means is most of the time it's the landowners doing it themselves and not selling the trees. However, based on the size of the area that you're working in and the quality of the trees, certainly some of those can be sold if you want to do that. In those situations, in order to increase both plant and structural and wildlife diversity in the area, it may be a better option to simply allow loggers to come in and implement what we call small patch cuts, instead of trying to take out those individual trees from within a stand and slip them out without damaging the residuals trees. So just a few things to consider here. Which ones to retain? As I mentioned, in general, we are looking to retain those that are producing mast for the food value. However, it might also be some evergreen trees for the cover value that they provide for different species. So it's really up to you, and there's lots of species that produce all kinds of whether it be seed or nuts, et cetera, for wildlife. And I've just listed a few of the more common ones that we typically find in the deciduous hardwood forest of the eastern US. Deer, of course, eat browse, and browse is the leaves and twig ends of plants. And some of these species are highly selected by deer, and some of them are not. And so some of the primary browse species that deer heavily select, if you're trying to manage your stand for higher quality food value for whitetail deer, the elms, especially winged and American, black gum, hackberry, or if you're farther down south, sugarberry, striped maple in the Northeast, secondary species, red maple, yellow poplar, ash. You can see the various ones listed. Now, I will mention here, I've used the words primary and secondary. Primary being those that are typically selected for over any others. Now, in your stand, you might be seeing that the deer really are hitting the yellow poplar or black locust or red maple, whatever, very hard. Wild cherry, black cherry is another good one. It's according to what they have available. If they don't have many other species available, you certainly will see them select those more heavily. But when you have a wide variety of trees available, those that are listed under the primary species typically are the ones that are selected greatest. There are lots of trees that don't provide that much, broadly stating, for a wide variety of wildlife, but there's some value in any of these tree species for something. But on a relative scale, these are ones that typically have less value for a broader suite of wildlife species than the ones that I just mentioned. But I'm not saying that you should kill any and all of any of these, except for something like Ailanthus or Royal Paulownia, other invasive non-native species. I certainly try to get those out of a stand, but especially for the native species, they all have something of value to provide for some wildlife species, but of course, some are more beneficial to a broader suite of wildlife species than others. Hinge cutting is something that has really gained in popularity, especially those who are managing small acreage tracts for whitetail deer. And the value of hinge cutting is to provide immediate horizontal cover to block the visibility in the stand. And this can be strongly influential on deer selecting these sites as bedding, or influencing deer movement through a stand where some of these trees have been hinged. And here are some species that I have listed that hinge very well. That is, they don't tend to split or, quote, barber chair, as you see right here with yellow buckeye, for example. This is very common. Never try to hinge a yellow buckeye. It's not going to work out very well. But these species hinge quite well. Now, hinge cutting can be conducted in a lot of different ways. And you can hinge cut a lot of different species in different sized trees. And you can reduce the value of a stand greatly, of course, by hinge cutting trees that probably shouldn't be cut. However, I remind people, and especially those who broadly characterize hinge cutting as bad, how does this differ from me going in and cutting the trees down or killing the trees that I don't want? So here I am simply leaning these trees over for the value of the cover that they provide, but I'm still leaving my high value trees, both from a species and from a form point of view. And so you can implement hinge cutting as part of timber stand improvement and actually increase the value of the stand because you are selecting for the more desirable or high value species. And in general, you're looking to hinge trees that are perhaps 3 to 8 inches in diameter, somewhere in that neighborhood. But another important consideration is the height of the hinging. If I'm hinging for deer and blocking visibility in the stand and providing better bedding cover, I'm going to be hinging the trees somewhere around 4.5 feet above ground, because that's where you get really the best effect with regard to closing down the visibility of the stand, and deer heavily selecting those for bedding. Of course, we use a lot of prescribed fire, and the use of fire in hardwoods has grown tremendously over the past 20 to 25 years, and even in the last 5 to 10 years, as especially more and more people in the upper Midwest and the Northeast are beginning to use fire in hardwoods. Of course, fire can be used in hardwoods without degrading and killing overstory trees. And we do this in a variety of seasons, both the growing season and dormant season. And you can see differential effects based on when you burn. Here is an example of burning during the mid-growing season. Obviously, this picture is in the late growing season, right as trees have gone into senescence. Took this picture in late October, early November when we were burning one year. But notice the height of the flames. We're talking about low intensity fire. By using low intensity fire, the incident of you damaging the tree is lessened tremendously. But the other thing that you have to pay attention to is the large debris that is adjacent to the base of the trunks. Of course, the large debris can catch on fire, and that's largely dependent on fuel moisture and humidity. But when that catches on fire, that holds the heat next to the tree for a longer period. And thus, that's when you get more damage to the bark, and for what is called in many cases, these cat faces that can develop, and that then can be the site where fungus disease can enter the stem and ultimately devalue or even kill the tree. So going through the woods, through the stand that you're going to burn, and just cruising through and checking things out and looking around at which are some of the primary trees that you're going to retain. Make sure there's not large debris immediately adjacent to the trunk, and just move that away 3 to 5 feet, and you'll be much more effective with regard to not doing any damage to the trees that you retain. And this is just a picture of the low intensity fire that we use. Most often we're just using low, slow moving backing fire. All we're looking to do is consume the leaf litter, top kill those small stems that are blocking sunlight from reaching the ground, and allowing the seed bank that is in the top few inches of soil to germinate and then respond in the understory. And here's just a picture of a stand. That one's been burned 6 times in 13 years, roughly a 2-year fire return interval. And note that this is a north facing stand with yellow poplar, white oak, black cherry, several thin bark species that do not respond well to fire unless it's very low intensity, like I just showed you. And in so doing, you can burn the stand over and over and retain those trees without doing damage. Here's another example of where we used prescribed fire in bottomland hardwood stands. And this stand had a lot of water oak and different oak species. This was in Alabama where we conducted this study. We, within 2 years, noted a 500+ increase in deer forage, doubling the increase with regard to turkey nesting cover with no overstory mortality. And here again, you can see where we have girdled and sprayed to kill these trees that we did not want, and leaving those that we did want, of course. So in so doing, you can strongly influence the composition of trees in the stand, as well as influence the composition and amount of cover that you have in the understory. This is what you see all too often. And even when implemented by forestry and wildlife agencies, foresters and biologists, particularly those who have not had much experience with prescribed fire, rather than wildfire, or as opposed to wildfire, where they're trying to burn out an area and reduce susceptibility of fire, or to put wildfire out. When you're burning, such as this right here, you see the heat signature, you see the flame links. That's too hot. You're going to scar up these trees. you're going to damage many of them, and you're going to kill some trees by using fire with this intensity. And you see how the wind and the topography is carrying the fire up slope. That is not a good idea. In general, unless you're wanting to kill the trees, and of course there are instances when you may want to kill the trees using fire instead of a mechanical means, with a chainsaw or what have you. You're looking to start the fire on the uphill side and allow it to slowly back down, and using fire against the wind, backing fire, as opposed to heading fire. But you may need to use heading fire depending on the environmental conditions on the day that you're burning. For example, if the humidity is up and the leaf litter is relatively damp, especially in the duff layer, and the fire is just hardly moving, you may need some wind to get the fire to move. But in general, we're talking about using low intensity backing fire. Here's an example, some pictures from a project where we implemented an improvement cut, allowing approximately 30% sunlight into the stand and using fire on a 2-year fire return interval. And the data that I will provide here or share with you is after the stand has been burned 4 times. Here you see the understory response and how we measure deer forage as a result, both inside and outside of exclusion cages. And after 7 years following the improvement cut, which was implemented in 2001, as well as the shelter wood and the first, we had treatments where we only used fire with no reduction of the canopy, and we compared to shelter wood harvest, shelter wood with fire, and improvement cut with fire. We see the greatest increase in deer forage, and this is after several prescribed fires. With the improvement cut and fire, the shelter wood only had 1 fire, because after the shelter wood is implemented, your first cut, they will come back in and remove the overwood, the remaining trees, typically 6 to 8 years after that initial harvest. Well, what we were doing was looking to see if a single fire implemented after the initial shelter wood harvest could influence the composition of the regenerating trees. And so that's what this treatment was designed to do. And then this is representative of using slow, low intensity back and fire only, without any overstory treatment. And then of course, control is closed canopy stands where there was no canopy removal and no fire. And of course, we see greater than a 600% increase in the amount of deer forage. This is very, very typical. This is not atypical at all. You totally can expect this. And the data are pretty consistent. We're looking at achieving somewhere in the neighborhood of 600 to 1,200 pounds of deer forage per acre fairly consistently by following these treatments. And here's just a look at the soft mass production, how that increased after an improvement cut and low intensity fire. And this is showing the amount of light that we got after killing a certain amount of the overstory through girdle and spray. And so you see here that we hit our target of about 30% sunlight entering the stand. And we measure this with electronic devices such that we're very accurate in terms of how much sunlight is coming in. And so it was very interesting to see the different amounts of growth and productivity in the understory with various amounts of sunlight coming in. Here is a look at the structure after this is a stand on a 4-year fire return interval, and how it differs from if you back that up to an 8-year fire return interval. Obviously, you see the trees getting larger and taller, and that's very influential with regard to which wildlife species you're managing for. So if I'm managing a stand, for example, primarily for wild turkey nesting or bedding cover for deer, this is the type of structure that I would rather have. If it were for wild turkey brooding or more deer forage, I would rather have a more frequent fire return interval that is going to have higher forage production. If I'm interested in rough grouse or various songbirds, Kentucky warbler, worm-eating warbler, various ones that require more of a more of a dense woody structure down low, this is the type of structure that would attract them more. So your fire return interval, your treatment level with regard to how much sunlight you're allowing to enter the stand, it all depends on which wildlife species you're managing for or other objectives that you may have. As I mentioned, there may be a need to kill the trees with fire, and that is what happened here. This is on public land where they were unable to get in and conduct mechanical overstory reduction. And so they used intensive fire purposefully to kill the trees and then create additional habitat for species such as those you see here. And now you see those species in this area, whereas before in a closed canopy situation, you would not see any of these. So just another example of how having a variety of successional stages and vegetation types across the forest, across the property, can lead to increased wildlife diversity. And of course, that can be very influential for others besides birds as well. Here, obviously, is black bear. Here is just an example of where we encourage people to think of every day as a potential burn day. Now, you can have a differential effect on the vegetation composition and structure by altering, of course, your fire frequency and altering the timing of burning, which season of the year you're conducting prescribed fire. But it's important to consider fire during all times of the year and never get stuck in a rut with regard to burning every 3 years all the time, or only burning in March or April or whatever the case may be. You'll have a greater variety and species richness of plants by altering your burning regime, which is it's very important. I want to close by going through, this is a case study, if you will. It's simply an area that we've worked on. This is one of our demonstration sites in East Tennessee, where we've worked for nearly about 23 years now. And here's a stand that in 2002 and 2003, the southern pine beetle came through and killed almost all of the Virginia and shortleaf pine that were in this mixed stand. And so remaining was a variety of oaks, red maple, a cherry here and there, maybe a mulberry. There were still a couple of pines left, as you see there in the stand. But our intent was to go through and further reduce the number of trees, begin using prescribed fire, and create truly a woodland situation, as opposed to just a thinned stand. And so here, I took this picture in April of 2006. And this is after we had burned the stand once in April of 2004. So the pine beetles have killed most of the pines. They are falling apart, as you see. We've marked additional trees to be girdled and sprayed, and that's what we did. And I just want to carry you through this process that we have seen over the years. So we burned it again in April of 2007, as you see here. And this is over about a 25 acre stand. You see some hickory in the stand, some black gum. Here we burned it again in September of 2008. You see one of the residual, one of the old pine logs on the ground there. And you see a stem here that's still standing, one that we girdled and sprayed. Of course, this one was left untreated. That's one of our residual trees that we kept. Here it is in August of 2010, and the understory is really beginning to change quite a bit now after those fires. We burned it again in September of 2011. Now, still note how much woody sprouting there is in the stand. Here it is in July of 12, and that's a measured 1,400 pounds of deer forage. That's dry weight per acre. And we're only including the plants that deer eat and the portions of plants that deer eat. That's not total biomass. So that's 1,400 pounds of deer forage in the stand. We burned it again in April of 2013. You see how we're varying our season of burning. And here's a picture of the stand in June of 2013, really transformed from where we started in 2004, 2006. And I want you to look at the composition of the plants that are responding in the understory. 59% were trees, resprouting trees. Only 5% forbs. That's the broadleaf herbaceous plants. And that is after 2 fires in April, 2 early growing season fires. After 1 September fire, so this is the 2 April fires and 1 September fire, now we have reduced the percentage of tree cover responding to 34% and increased the percentage of forbs to 25%. After the next September fire, now this has the stand has been burned with 2 April fires and 2 September fires. The relative percentage of trees is down to 19, 26% forbs. After another April fire, you see the relatively even distribution of plant types responding throughout the stand. And now with this type of composition and structure, we're seeing woodland obligate species come into the stand, increasing our wildlife species diversity. Burned again in March 2016. You note the trees here that they are not scarred up. Here is the structure in September of 2017, outstanding for white-tailed deer, of course. Every tree standing and alive is a mast producer. Every dead tree that is standing was killed with our chainsaws and a squirt bottle, not with prescribed fire. Here's a picture in July of 2018. Now I want you to notice a couple of things. Of course, this area is more open, relatively open. What that means is we killed a lot of trees here. So we call that variable retention. When we go into an area and it has a lot of undesirable trees, well, we're going to kill a lot of undesirable trees. And then in other little areas of the stand, well, all of these are good. And so we will leave those. And so what happens is just by, default, you'll get some areas that are more open and some areas that are a little more closed. And it's in these areas where it's a little more open that you get faster, denser growth. These areas are ideal for turkey nesting cover. And then if I turn to the right and walk up the hill, maybe 40 yards, literally, I walk into this little area right here, you see that we left more trees because all of these trees are high value wildlife trees, especially for deer, turkeys, and various songbirds. And so you see that the structure of the understory is less dense and not as tall as the area where there was more sunlight. And these are perfect spots for broods. It's more open, broods can get through here very easily. It's also more breezy, and wildlife will use these spots as a summer thermal refugia where they can get a little breeze and it's cooler in these spots than in more open spots. And of course, we're getting many of the woodland obligates coming into the stand, and we're seeing increased species diversity, wide number of wildlife species using the area. Burned it again in April of 2000. Here it is in August in 2020. Here it is in August of 2020. So now this stand has been burned 8 times since 2004 with low intensity prescribed fire. Of course, we have altered the seasons in which we have burned. Now look at the percentage of vegetation. We've converted the understory now to where we have relative coverage, 50% forbs, only 8% trees, resprouting trees, and the nutritional carrying capacity then for white-tailed deer and wild turkeys has certainly gone up because of this. We have completely changed the composition of the understory. That's on average across this stand, 1,200 pounds of deer forage per acre. And when we compare that to a food plot on the property of ladino and red clover and chicory, it's very comparable. 1,800 pounds per acre of forage in the food plot measured when it was sampled on June 16th, whereas this right here, we measured this in August. We have 1,200 pounds of deer forage in the woodland. And so considering how much cheaper this is on a per pound of forage basis, and obviously the timing at when this forage is available. It's very important, and it also provides that cover component that is critical for other species as well. So I'm not saying, you know, someone shouldn't plant a food plot. I mean, I'm a huge proponent of food plots. It's a lot of fun to plant something and see wildlife respond to that. But the point is, consider your woods as much as you consider your fields with regard to providing both food and cover across your property. And in this stand, we have on average, this is, you know, from multiple plots that we've measured across the stand, 48 trees per acre, coincidentally, 48% sunlight entering the stand. So nearly 50% sunlight coming in on average across this stand. Of course, in some areas, it could be 100%. In other areas, it might only be 20 to 30%. So it's variable. Remember that variable retention, and equals out to about 50 square feet of basal area per acre. Now, if I go right over in this area, about 250 yards outside of this stand, this is what I would walk into: a closed canopy control. We have not cut or killed any trees in this area, but we have burned it. This area right here has been burned 6 times since 2004 with low intensity fire. And look at some of the species that we have in here: sugar maple, American beech, not exactly trees that are renowned for being able to burn in, but with this low intensity prescribed fire. And right here is a picture of us burning that very stand that you're looking at. With low intensity prescribed fire, we can consume the leaf litter without harming the trees. However, without that sunlight coming in, see, closed canopy condition, only 3% sunlight, you don't get the response in the understory that you do if you have at least 20 to 30% sunlight coming in. So that's a very important consideration. So in closing and summary, with regard to this woodland condition, and remember that by definition, a woodland is a stand that has somewhere between 30 to 80% canopy cover, and the understory is dominated by herbaceous species. So without that, you simply have a thin forest stand. But when you have 30 to 80% canopy cover and a herbaceous dominated understory, that then meets the definition of a woodland. And what I would say to you is that if I had to choose only one or the best vegetation type to provide both food and cover resources for the widest variety of wildlife, it's an open oak woodland. I'll say oak woodland, oak pine or oak hickory. These open woodlands are outstanding with regard to their food and cover potential. In fact, for those who are interested in deer, I consider these spots the same as I would a warm season food plot, because the forage that is produced in these stands from spring green up through mid to late summer is simply outstanding. And by treating this with the variable retention, for those who are interested in wild turkey, as well as different songbird species that have different requirements with regard to the density of cover for nesting, these stands can provide that for all of them. Because again, with the variable retention, you can have a variable effect on the structure throughout the stand. Frequent fire is essential, but always consider mixing your timing of fire up to get a good diversity of species that are responding in the understory. And of course, use low intensity fire. And another very important tip is to concentrate on those more exposed south and west facing slopes as opposed to north and east facing slopes, simply because, well, 2 reasons. One, the species of trees on the drier, more exposed slopes will be better with regard to being able to withstand prescribed fire, but also those sites are so much easier to burn, and you have so many more potential burn days in those stands as opposed to those that are much more moist on a north or east facing aspect. So with that, Luke, if you want to take time and try and answer some questions, be more than happy to do so.
Great, thank you very much. I learned a lot from that. That was great. Everybody attending, feel free to drop any questions in on the chat. I'm going to put, somebody asked a little bit ago about, will this be available? I just put into the chat the link where the recording of this talk will be posted. It usually takes us a few days to get it processed and put up on YouTube. But as you're putting your own questions in, I have been jotting down questions because I know there's sometimes a little bit of a lull. Also, just want to be cognizant of everybody's time. It's just past 1 o'clock. I appreciate all the stuff, great insights you gave us. Oh, here we go. Dr. Harper told us he could stay on just a few minutes past. Please let us know when you need to head out.
No problem.
So first question, Amy Curran wrote, can you review the formula for the herbicide again? Which was on bottom? And I would like to add to that as well. I've seen glyphosate recommended for hack and squirt uses. Could you maybe describe a little bit about both those questions, the formula for the herbicide you recommend and whether glyphosate or other herbicides might be useful to think about too?
Yeah, the mixture that we use is 50% Garlon 3A, 40% water, 10% Arsenal AC. And the reason for that is, of course, Garlon contains triclopyr, Arsenal contains imazapyr, and those herbicides, as well as any of them, are going to be weak on some species and do very well on other species. Well, we evaluated all kinds of different mixtures and rates over a long period of time, and what we found is this one performs best, and regardless of tree species that you use this on, it will die. And although this mixture contains imazapyr, which is residual in the soil for a while, it does not harm your non-target species. Now, that's not to say if you applied it to a clonal species, which literally is on the same root system, that another stem would not be killed. But do not worry about treating an undesirable stem beside an oak or hickory that you want to treat, and that oak or hickory be impacted. It won't. In fact, of those trees that have split trunks like this, we've done a fair amount of experimentation where we will only treat one, and this is the only one that dies. This one will remain alive. So you have very good control over which species are going to be impacted by this, and no need to worry about the residual impact. And I saw one note there asking about insects. To my knowledge, there is no impact whatsoever on the insect community. Of course, these are herbicides, not insecticides. By treating and killing some plants, of course, various insects might not have, obviously would not, you would impact the any flowering of the trees that you kill. But in terms of direct impacts on insects, I have never seen or read anything that would indicate that that is an issue.
Thank you, Craig. Another question popped in. Thanks for answering that one too. Any concern also with firewood on that herbicide? Any residual herbicides making into the firewood that you might be concerned about?
I'm not sure what that's asking.
Whether as the insecticides, whether they go systemically into the wood or the structure of the wood, if you were to burn that later, is there enough herbicide that you might want to be concerned about either burning?
Oh, no, none whatsoever. So if you're wanting to kill the tree and then allow it to cure by standing, which is fine, you certainly can do that, and there's no there's no concern, consideration that I'm aware of or have ever heard of or read with regard to whether that tree, that no impact on the firewood.
Jeff also asked, he's seen places where trees have fallen in the woods and there used to be a lot of great browse that would come up. Now he's seeing one of these, one of my favorite invasive species, Japanese stilt grass, growing where these trees fall. Do you have any tips to fight off these invasive species if you're letting in more light? How do you handle that?
Yeah, we do quite a bit of that. And so there's always going to be invasive species in most of these woods, whether you treat the overstory to allow more sunlight to come in or not. And so with regard to Japan grass or Japanese stilt grass, whatever you want to call it, we do a lot of treatment for it in woods where we have increased the amount of sunlight. And what we use is an herbicide called Plateau, which contains imazapic, and you can use that at relatively low rates, about 4 to 6 ounces per acre, or about 0.75% solution. And you can use that as a pre-emergence application or a post-emergence application. Of course, if you use it as a post-emergence application, you should include non-ionic surfactant to get a better effect. But we literally will line up with backpack sprayers and target an area and move through and use this selective herbicide. And we've published some papers looking at the effect of this application on Japan grass. It does very well. It's selective, and we see excellent response from native species in the seed bank after we've used this. But you know, there's many. There's English ivy and Oriental bittersweet, and I mean just any number of problem plants that you can have. And what I tell folks is these days, that's just standard operating procedure. So I don't bat an eye at invasive species coming in. I figure, of course, that's going to happen. And so that's just part of stand management, just like we might continue to go in and manipulate overstory structure or the amount of sunlight coming in over time. So there's always something to do. And, you know, if you're managing fields, for example, you're always managing succession, setting back succession, influencing the composition and structure. And I just see it no different in the woods. It's something that we have to look at and consider. But there's definitely some good applications. And with the microstegium, the best one, you can use a grass selective herbicide, such as clethodim. You could use a broad spectrum herbicide, such as glyphosate. But the one that we have gotten the best results from is the Plateau, or some generic that contains imazapic. Not only does that kill the grass post-emergence, but you also have that residual activity. It does very well, and it's perfectly fine to apply underneath your desirable species such as oaks and hickory. I will say one thing. I would not apply Plateau underneath the black walnut. We have seen some decline in black walnut where we have applied Plateau, but that was at relatively high rates. But do consider that. But for most of the tree species, and in fact, I cannot think of another one that we have applied Plateau under and had any problems with.
Great, thank you for sharing. Bob Martin asked, have you done any prescribed fire in the Savage River State Forest? That is a state forest here in Western Maryland. And I'll just note, Dr. Harper is working out of Tennessee. So he might come out and have some recommendations for how that might work, but be probably a little bit out of his wheelhouse.
Yeah, I am not familiar with that area. I have not worked in it, no.
Somebody else asked, actually, I think it's the same, Bob Martin also asked, if you have substantial timber harvest leaving only groups of mature desirable seed trees, for example, white oaks, how does that resulting habitat compare to improvement versus fire?
All right, I'm trying to pull this up. substantial timber harvest, leaving only groups of mature desirable seed trees, and that's good. How does that? All right. That could be regarded as the same thing. And so remember when I said that you could sell the trees that you would be taking out? So essentially, I believe what you're describing there is the same thing, where there was a timber harvest and they left some residual trees, desirable species. And so in that case, you can either let that go and let the the regenerating trees come up for cover and for a future forest, or you can treat that what you have resulting as an open woodland, and then use low intensity fire to keep all of those sprouting trees beat back. And so you're allowing them to grow for 2 to 4 years, what have you, and then you implement a low intensity fire that top kills those stems, that consumes the leaf litter, that stimulates the seed bank, and you will have a wider variety of plants, especially herbaceous plants, coming in, as opposed to if you only allow the regenerating trees to come up. But of course, that's obviously based on your objective, what you're wanting to get out of the area.
Great. Jeff asked as well, he says he sees beech trees taking over as a more shade tolerant species. Is there a way to use hack and squirt to kill all those beeches but not translocate to other species nearby? I think
so
good.
So if you, with the mixture that I mentioned, if you treat a beech, that's not going to impact a white oak that is adjacent to the beech tree.
Yeah, one nice thing about hack and squirt is it's very targeted application method.
Yeah, whether it's hack and squirt or girdle and spray, and I use the small chainsaw and girdle rather than hack and squirt, because I can't cut a tree down with a hatchet or a machete, but I can a chainsaw. And so as I'm going through these stands working, there will be cases where I want to cut this tree down and do that commonly. And for example, if I want some more sprouting to have better structure for nesting, or deer forage, for example, and it's a black gum, I will cut that tree and not treat the stump to allow it to sprout. And that's something that you just can't do with a hatchet or a machete. So it gives you more options. If you're wanting to hinge a tree, for example, for the horizontal cover, you can't do that with a hatchet or a machete unless it's a very small tree. So using a small chainsaw gives you that flexibility, and with a small saw, you can carry that all day long and it not wear you out, and it works very well.
Great. We have 2 more questions, and thank you for your time, and thank you for everybody for staying on. These are a little bit related. Both have to do with deer overgrazing, which is a big issue here in Maryland. Terry Tabler asks, in Carroll County, he's got oak species that are dominant, and the desirable hardwood and conifer sprouts are generally consumed. What survives are mostly witch hazel. Are these beneficial, or should I eliminate them?
Well, of course, there are some birds that would eat the witch hazel seed. Deer will eat, a leaf or two, but witch hazel is not a selected species by whitetails. What I would encourage you to do is to fence out a portion of the woods if you can, and then that will enable you to have a different effect with regard to the species composition and the structure. I understand if you need some shade for the livestock, but it's like when somebody asks about their pasture, and should I delay my haying or grazing to allow the initial grassland bird nests to hatch and come off? Well, you can, but if you do, your forage quality is going to go right down the tubes. And so a much better strategy is to have some areas dedicated to your wildlife objectives, and then have other areas dedicated to your livestock or agriculture objectives, and, mesh them as possible. But in those situations, it's hard to get both out of that. In the overgrazed woods, if you have livestock in, mature.
Overgrazed by deer.
Okay. I'm sorry, I misunderstood.
All right. That's all right.
I thought that they were talking about grazing by livestock. Okay, I'm sorry. No, in that case, I would shoot more does. I would try to reduce the deer density by shooting more female deer. That's obviously the problem there. And, I understand that can be challenging in some circumstances, but that's the answer.
And
the solution, if you can.
Yeah, Peggy Cook had a similar situation in her area. Again, overbrowsed by deer. She gets mostly mountain laurel and ferns in the understory. How could you encourage more diversity in the ground layer species? You mentioned shooting more does. She also notes she cannot burn where she's at. She has 3 acres. We have a lot of these sort of small parcel properties.
Mm-hmm.
Have you found? I'll add to that question. Can you outgrow the deer population? Can you provide more forage in these circumstances by some of this release that you described? By if you open up the forest enough, that you will have stuff that just outgrows the ability of deer to graze them down.
Yes, you can, but of course that is dependent on the size of the area that you cut or clear, and also on deer density. So that's not a yes or no question. It's one of those, well, if then type answers. So what we're doing with fire is we are continually top killing the resprouting stems, and we're consuming the leaf litter. When you consume the leaf litter, that allows the seed bank to germinate, and that's where you're getting, this increase in species richness, herbaceous species richness in the stand. Unfortunately, you can't get that without fire. Now, you can set the stems back by going in later and mechanically, usually with a chainsaw or whatever, to cut those stems, set them back, allowing more sunlight to come in. Obviously, that's much more labor intensive than using prescribed fire, but that's where you're limited. And on a 3-acre stand, unless the majority of trees are cut, and even then, according to deer density, you may not get the response that you're hoping for until you reduce the deer density. That's going to be key. And also, I understand on 3 acres, you're not holding any deer. All of the deer are coming into you from surrounding areas. And so in that situation, you're going to get the best results if you can work with the neighbors and everyone, if possible, kind of get on the same page with regard to what needs to be done for deer density.
Great. I know I have more questions about how you could implement fire on smaller acreages. Have you ever had anybody be able to do that? Do you guys are you able to pull that off in Tennessee at all, or anywhere you've worked?
We do it commonly, and even if the stand might be 15 or 40 acres, what have you, we still will go in with backpack blowers and blow out a fire break around an acre, 3 acres, a half acre, what have you, and then just burn that small area where you've created the fire break around that. And so we will have areas within a larger stand where we burn small blocks within the stand at different times of the year. And what that does then is cause the resprouting to come up at different times of the year, and that spreads out higher quality browse for deer over a longer period of time than having one pulse. If you only burn in March and then you got a pulse at spring green up, or if you only burn in May or what have you, and then you get one pulse of vegetation coming up then. But if you spread that out through the year, you'll get pulses of vegetation coming up and increase your nutritional carrying capacity. But to answer your question, yes, we do a lot. We implement a lot of prescribed fire on small properties and on small areas. Ideally, with regard to, you have to think about the core home range and area of use by wildlife species at different times of the year. Most of our fires are going to be anywhere from like a ½ acre to 10 acres. Not many times are we burning 20 to 50 acres and never, 100 acres or whatever. And that's very different from public lands management. I understand that, but ideally with private landowners, why would you ever want to set back, succession, burn, or otherwise disturb a huge area, especially for species that have smaller area requirements during particular times of the year? So think about turkey broods, think about adult whitetail deer during the summertime, whose summer core area, 50% of their time is spent on an area the size of about 35 to 50 acres. So dispersing your management in smaller units across the property is a better approach.
Great. Well, I think we're going to have another presentation on fire and how to implement prescribed burns. I'm sure we could go on for a lot longer, but we've gone over already 20 minutes. So thank you, Dr. Harper. We've got a bunch of thank yous coming in on the chat. Thank you everybody for joining us today. Again, this will be available recorded on our YouTube channel. And any final words, Dr. Harper?
Number one, I'll just say thanks to everyone for listening. But with regard to forest stand improvement, we do have an extension publication available on that. And so, I should have mentioned this, but when somebody asked about the herbicide mixture and which tree species and which are good for browse or mast or whatever, all of that is listed in there. If they're interested, they can go to my webpage. If you search for Craig Harper and University of Tennessee, you'll find that, and the icons for various publications are there. And for most of them, you can either read or download or click on a different tab if you'd like to purchase a hard copy.
I just put those links. I put the link for purchasing that forest stand improvement publication for $10, and also your homepage, which I've been going back and forth to and pulling up articles as you we're going through your talk. So those are both up there for anybody who's interested in doing more research. A few more thank yous coming in. Really appreciate it, and look forward to being in touch in the future.
Thank you, and good luck to everyone on your management.
Great. Thank you, everybody, and we hope to see you next month to learn more about Maryland's cave bats. Take care, and thank you, everybody.